This is CMX Games DesignCast, and we are doing episode 6 this week, on this Christmas week.
We are indeed.
I am actually design casting here from Houghton, Michigan. We're up in the great Copper Country. Dave will be joining me in a couple days.
On Tuesday. I'll be up there Tuesday.
And we're hoping to maybe go someplace and in a local establishment and play the game. See if anybody wants to check it out.
By local establishment, he probably means the KBC.
Probably do, yeah. But I will, we'll be posting about that later in the week. But that's not what we're here to be talking about today. Today we'll be talking about designing the game Copper Country, not returning to the Copper Country for Christmas. So last week we talked about playtesting, and we got maybe about halfway through our thoughts on playtesting. We got through sort of our big redesign, and this week we're going to continue. So Dave, what exactly are we going to be talking about?
I just want to start off by rewinding a little bit. So, in the beginning I was working on the game a lot by myself and nobody was playing it, and I wasn't really playing it that much because you can just sit there and dink around with cards and pieces on the board and you think things are working and you have no idea how long a game actually takes and stuff like that. And then we had our first big playtesting session in Portland, and we learned that the biggest problem with the game at the time was that it was too long. That was pretty universal.
We could point our fingers at certain things that made it long. So it wasn't quite clear why it was so long, and so we had a lot of ideas to try to make it less long. But there wasn't a single thing that you could really point to. We just had a bunch of ideas that we could try to make it shorter.
And that's a thing about feedback in general. Like in this case, it's kind of obvious because we're not making a rule that says the game is X lengths. Really, I mean, we had set a score and it took so long to get to the score. But with feedback, someone can give you feedback and say, well, I hate this X thing about the game, but it might not be that thing's fault. It might be something else's fault entirely that makes this other thing stick out as being a problem. For example, if nobody's using an action in the game, there's two things that could be happening. That action could be undercosted or overcosted, not good enough, or all the other actions could be way too good. So you have to sort of figure out what the problem is.
Yeah, it could be just that the move doesn't, that the utility of the move, that the game didn't exhibit the utility of the move in a meaningful way, right? It could be a really powerful move and just nobody realized, the game didn't explain it to them in a meaningful way.
Yeah, the game didn't, show them how good it was up front. So anyway, the biggest problem, game's too long. So we worked pretty hard to try to figure out how to shorten mostly copper production between Portland and Protospiel. And that involved removing, two things. One was choosing cards and speeding up copper production, because we removed combos from cards, correct?
Yes.
So for the time being, we had removed the combos from the cards. So hopefully players could look at the community cards and make their decision about what cards they wanted to take in their hand faster, because people were just obsessing over it too much, because you really did have to look at 5 different possible reasons to take a card from community.
Yeah, so each card had both a type and then a bonus, a numerical bonus, and the numerical bonus would vary based on what other types that card was played with. And so you really had to look at your hand, look what was available for you to take. Look at your hand, look what was available, and kind of go back and forth for a while to figure out what your best move was there. And then when you went to produce, you had to remember, okay, what was the combo that I had?
Yes, which cards was I supposed to play together again? Which buildings do I have here? Because those also have different numbers, and maybe that number is better than the combo that you had. So.
Yep.
Anyway, so that was one thing we tried to do to speed up the game, was cut the combos out. So we tested that. And the other thing was just trying to speed up copper production itself, and I don't remember how exactly I mean, maybe we thought that removing the combos was also going to speed up copper production. It was like a twofer.
Yeah, I think so.
Like the bonuses were far more straightforward on your cards. So picking which cards you wanted to play to produce copper was easier. And then actually figuring out whether or not you had produced copper was also much easier and therefore faster. So we tried those two things, and that succeeded in making the game faster. What do we do with actions? Do we do anything with actions? I mean, we tried the sort of phases version of the game, but that had the opposite effect on speed, so that was good to learn. So we tried those things, the game sped up a bit, and then we realized something else is the biggest problem with the game at that point, right? Like it became randomness. The game was too random.
Yep.
Because we had
cruel. To some extent, how like just brutal the game was when there were just stacks on stacks of guys in the graveyard. But you know,
yes, yeah.
That one at least could have been a tuning issue. That also contributed to length of the game actually overall. It's just like how many guys you were losing, the time that it took you to recover from setbacks in your mining operation. Those were sort of things that were just kind of like, okay, sure, we can tune that. But yeah, the main thing was from Protospiel was just the randomness was coming from all sorts of different places and just combining to make it completely unmanageable to have much say over the success of what you were trying to set out to do. There's just so many different random factors that could contribute.
Yeah, there were the cards that were available to you in your hand, which was, at the time, more random. There was the cards you revealed from the production deck, random and remains to this day random. Yep. I mean, there was. It's not like we just made a random game like this. I mean, it was part of the theme. It was there on purpose, thematically, and it just didn't work. So we had to roll it back, which is fine. So the production cards were random, and then the disaster outcomes were random and random separately from your copper production.
And you could be impacted by somebody else's on a random chance too.
Yes, and there were universal or at least multiplayer disasters, basically, where one player would work and then everybody around them would also have to roll random dice and see if their workers also died. And the way it was tuned, yes, they were going to. So there were just too many sources of randomness in the game. So then we worked on the set matching stuff and to really, really cut back on how random copper production was.
Now the main source of randomness is just from that production deck. There's a small amount of randomness in how you assemble your hand, because you'll have a choice of 4 face-up capital cards to take into your hand, but that still means that you've got a reasonable amount of choice. The cards that are there for you to choose are random, but you do have a reasonable amount of control over what ends up in your hand still. And so then, yeah, the main random source of randomness is just revealing those cards from the production deck. And so you're more responsible for what happens to you. If you're pushing your miners too hard and the randomness says that there's a disaster, well, that's basically your fault. It's not the fault of the decks. You knew that there was a more likely chance that you would that would happen to you, and when it pops up, yeah, it happens.
So yeah, what Scott's talking about right now is once you've produced copper on your turn, if you want to keep going, you are free to do so, but you are overworking your miners, is what we call it. So if you hit any disasters while you're overworking, you lose all the options you had. Like normally when you hit a disaster, you have 3 to 4 options available to you with how to deal with it. But if you're overworking, you have no options, and people are going to die or go on strike or something.
And actually, those options that we have available on disasters, and actually even on some of the other cards, are also an example of how we sort of tamped down the randomness. You really do have a choice as to how to respond to these disasters, how much resources you want to trade, essentially, for the safety of your workers. Is one way to look at it.
Right, so a disaster pops up now. it used to just be you'd roll a different dice and your guys would be dead probably, and then the people around you also. So now when a disaster pops up, it's like, okay, are you overworking? No. All right, well then you have some choices here. Do you want to get some copper from this disaster, except that it's also going to cost someone their life? Or do you want to play some cards from your hand and maybe just, instead of killing people, they just get mad at you for working in bad conditions and they run off and join all the other miners who are organizing or getting mad about working in the mines? Or maybe if you've built enough houses for your workers, maybe you can even just get away with playing some cards, or possibly even having no effect at all.
Yeah. And all of those choices feel really good, as opposed to, bad, good, whatever. They're hard choices, and you're responsible for them, as opposed to just having a dice clatter down, and that's what happens to me.
And another thing, going back to the card drawing, in the set building game, we also have the terrain tokens on the map, which really help to sort of mitigate randomness, because there will be tokens on the map, and when you work a mine site with like a capital card icon on it, it's the things you're playing from your hand to get.
Don't you have an actual icon to show?
Yeah, here you go. The equipment icon on a terrain token, and there's the surface development icon on a terrain token. So you can look at the map and see, like, oh man, I really don't have a surface card, and I think I could build a good hand if I had one. Well, you can go work at the site that has that icon on it, and that will mitigate the randomness of the capital cards that were available to you on the turns when you drew. So we've really worked really hard to put a lot more choice into the players' hands since Protospiel.
Seems to be working really well so far.
Yeah, it's had very, very good reception since we played it at GameholeCon. We played it that way twice. We just went up to I'm Bored up in Middleton, and we played it there twice. We've played it ourselves a bunch. Played it with family and friends, and the reception's been really, really positive since the.
Played it at Jason's
building. Yes, at Jason's party. Oh, we should talk about that. Let's move that on down the road a little bit.
Yep.
You made me forget this awesome point that I was going to make. Oh, okay. So yeah, the biggest problem with the game was randomness at that point. So we're in a good place now where we feel like that's under control. And then we realized that the biggest problem with the game was it was far too complicated to figure out how many times you got to reveal production cards when you were working, and that became the biggest problem with the game.
And part of the reason for that was we wanted to have a push your luck mechanic to mining, where you have some number of sort of safe shifts. You can reveal a certain number of production cards to try to produce copper, and a certain number of those are safe. And then if you want to overextend your workers, either because what you've seen is bad or you're maybe falling behind or something, then you can sort of push your luck and have these more dangerous draws from the deck where, if you see a disaster, somebody's going to die. Like, that always felt really good. The decisions that you made were always a lot of fun every time we played it with that. The question was just coming up for a way to figure out how to decide on, okay, how do you determine how many safe cards you can see, and then how many unsafe you can see.
Yeah, it was really, it was then and still is always fun watching somebody with their hand hovering over the production deck deciding if they're going to push it just one more shift or not. So the way it was then is that each of your worker and the buildings you can build on the map would each have given you one safe shift and one overwork. So if you had your worker, your shaft house, your hoist house, you'd have 3 safe and 3 overworks, okay? And you take your safe shifts first and then decide, well, after each safe shift even, decide if you want to keep going. And then you'd be overworking, decide if you want to keep going. But the poor rock reduced the number of safe shifts you got. That's all relatively simple. So, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, I've got 3 of each, but there's 2 poor rock now. I lose 2 of my safes, now I'm at 1 and 3. So already this is getting complicated, and it's pretty basic. And then on top of that, each company house you had adjacent to the mine site would convert 1 overwork shift into 1 safe shift. So now in the same situation where I had 1 and 3 safe and overwork, if I had 2 company houses, that would go from 1 and 3 to 2 and 2, and then to 3 and 1. So I'd have 3 safe and 1 overwork. So like, for someone who had played the game 100 times, like, all right, you could figure it out, and even I would not get it right all the time. The problem was that it worked so well for mechanics.
Yeah.
But it was too complicated, and eventually we just had to. Mostly me, because I hear it. It's too complicated. I have to admit, yes, it's too complicated. But the problem was coming up with a way that felt as good for the mechanics of the game, without all the complexity.
And one of the biggest sources of complexity, like we did sort of feel like the 1-in-1 was okay, and then once you guys started, like the conversion was maybe what was really throwing people off.
Well, there were a lot of corner cases involved with the conversion when you don't have shifts to convert, or you have, or like there's so many Porok that you have 0 safe shifts, and then what do you do?
And so the thematic reason for the company houses doing this was it was important to us. It was the company houses. You build the company houses for your workers. They are more taken care of, and they're going to work more safely for the mining company.
Right. That was the key thematic thing that we wanted.
And we actually tried one game without that theme, where it just kind of made your mining a little bit more efficient around your houses. That sort of, I guess it fell a little flat, maybe. It sort of thematically, it makes more sense that the things that really contribute to your mining being more productive are the actual surface buildings that you build, like the shaft house and the hoist house. Whereas the company houses, it didn't feel quite right that all of a sudden, you were just more productive working around it.
Yeah.
So then I guess the big sort of thought that, suggestion that kind of turned things in a different direction was just thinking, well, okay, if we want the disaster or the company houses to actually make working there around them safer, then they should actually have a direct impact on the disasters, not just shift safe shifts to dangerous shifts. It should actually help you out when you do see a disaster.
Then it was like, well, how do we do that?
Yeah.
We know we want them to make working safer. Maybe we can just do something directly with disasters. How do we do it? So what we've done now is when a disaster pops up, and you'll see we talked about this earlier a little bit today. So here's a disaster card. Basically, each row is a choice on this card. So the first row, this is the overworking or default row. Like basically, if you're overworking, then 2 guys are going to go join everyone else in on rest. That's what this icon means. And then this row down here is interesting because disasters, one of the things that we've also done with disasters is give you an opportunity to get some copper out of them. So this row lets you complete your claim. You can take a card that you weren't able to complete before and complete it now, but one of your guys is dead because he's working in bad conditions. In this case, that's because one of your disgruntled workers is shooting up the houses of the scabs and getting killed. And here was the big change that for company houses and that allowed us to simplify work, period. If you have 1 company house, instead of losing 2 guys, you can lose 1 guy and play a card from your hand. If you've got 2 company houses, you don't lose anybody as long as you can play a card from your hand. So this is how we made it so that company houses affect the safety of your workforce without adding any complexity or math.
So now what we had essentially was instead of 1-in-1 for each of the workers and buildings that you have on the site where you're working, 1 safe and 1 dangerous shift, they just give you 2, and then the Porok subtracted 1. We played around with the numbers exactly of how many the Porok subtract, but basically 1 each. And then, so it's super simple to figure out how many cards you can see now. We played a game like that, and without overwork, we missed overwork.
Yeah, overwork was definitely an awesome thing that we wanted to bring back.
So then it just made sense that, okay, well, overwork is just, you've already produced copper. All the shifts after that become, overworking. So as soon as you produce a copper card on your turn, all the rest of the shifts then become these dangerous shifts. So again, you're sort of in control of it.
which came from like I had a whole list of, I probably have the mess of a notepad here, so a whole list of things like, so what is overwork at the top of the list, and then it was
Yeah.
like,
This very philosophical question.
yes, what is overwork? One of the things on the list is, have you produced copper or not? But another thing might be, well, maybe you're overworking after you've turned over a number of cards, depending on how many Porok are on the site or how many Porok aren't on the site. Or what else? Can't remember. They were all much worse ideas than the one we came up with, which both works really well thematically. Like, your workers have gotten you copper already this turn, and they're like, yes, we did our job. And you're like, no, you did not. Keep working.
Yep.
And it works really well for gameplay, really, because if you don't hang overwork on producing copper, then someone who is not succeeding is going to get a penalty put on them for not succeeding. Whereas the way it works now, if I've produced copper on my turn, I am now, I've gotten victory points in the game, and now I have this threat to me to continue.
Yep. So now everything's fairly simple, and actually, if you hold the card up again, the other thing that we decided was that the effects of the company houses and the choices that you have should all be fairly explicit on the card. One other option that we had kicking around was, well, what if the options are just built into the rules? Okay, so you can maybe redraw a disaster or whatever for each company house or something, or but here what we have is that everything is just laid out, and it gives us a nice way to differentiate a lot of the cards as well. So here, this is sort of a labor-related card, and so then the costs that you can use to get around the disaster are your labor capital cards. And then when generally in this card, when bad things happen, it involves your workers going into unrest, as opposed to this disaster, the Widowmaker, where people basically die as a consequence. And the cards that you generally devote to getting around it are things like equipment and explosives, which is the Widowmaker being the one-man drill, which made mining more dangerous since you're doing it by yourself now.
So we have done. So yeah, we started with the game's too long. Moved on to that was randomness. Randomness was huge, and then we moved on to figuring out how much you can work and what exactly is involved with working was too complicated. And each one of these, especially the last two, each one of these was a really big and pretty intense redesign of game mechanics. And now we play the game, and we don't know what the biggest problem with the game is anymore, which I think means we're in a really good place. Like, we can play the game, as we've said, repeatedly with different groups of people in different venues and have them really enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. So now I guess we are starting to look to start outsourcing that search for what's the problem. what can we work on here?
Yeah. I mean, certainly we know there are things we want to tinker with.
Yep.
But there are no game-breaking issues that we're aware of right now.
An interesting thing, too, is one thing we mentioned earlier was the brutality of the game, and that sort of just shook itself out almost in the course of adding more choices. We basically, more or less put the decision-making, the responsibility for the brutality onto the shoulders of the players themselves, rather than sort of the game. There's really that's just sort of become a non-issue almost.
I like to kill my workers. What can I say?
Yeah, I'm much more risk averse in terms of my workforce, and I feel like I pay for it every game.
The last game we played, I got seriously stalled out mid-game because I had 3 dudes dead, and I just didn't bring them back. I didn't get my immigrants.
Well, you got rescued by the Great Strike, so.
Yeah, a little bit. But then if you look at the Great Strike, like basically you get all your miners back because you get a bunch of scabs that come into town and you can just employ them as many as you want. But then if you look at the end of the game board, I've got 3 dead miners.
Just gave you more.
Basically, I just pushed them all right back into the mines.
Yeah.
Work, damn it.
Yep. Meanwhile, I was sitting pretty. I hardly had anybody lost and came in dead last. So
by the end, you did have some people.
I had a few people. Yeah, I had a few rotten turns at the end there that really. I was trying to be safe most of the game, and it just didn't pay off.
So yeah, I mean that's where we are right now. We want to get the game out into more people's hands and hear what they have to say.
Yep, it would be very interesting. Definitely, it's a scary new territory to just send the game off to somebody and have them play it without us staring over their shoulder.
Yeah, which means we have to write the rules down, which would probably be its own episode.
Yep.
Oh my god. What a chore. And very difficult thing to do, to write rules for a game.
I think it'd be easy.
Yeah. So next week, I think we're going to talk about games telling stories. I think will be our subject for next week, and how a game of Copper Country tells a different story every time you play.
Sounds great.
All right, so that was episode 6.
Next
Next week was 7.
Bye.